that same summer when I turned 13, I took that wonderful train ride for 3 days and I arrived in Chicago. Getting in Chicago, I actually had instructions. This was so many years ago. It was a safety that we don't know today. People could go and travel like that. A 13-year-old traveling cross country, I was completely, everywhere I went, people would sit and talk and say, "You're traveling alone," and they'd welcome you into their family. Well, when I got to Chicago, I came out of the train station and I had written instructions on how to take a taxi to my grandmother's flat on North Halsted Street. I arrived on North Halsted Street, paid the driver, ran across the sidewalk, and there was my grandmother's name written on a little label by a button next outside the building, Louise Child. I pushed the button, and soon my grandmother's voice came back through a crackly little speaker. "Hello? Grandma, it's Kenny, I'm here." She said, "Kenny, I'll push the button. You'll hear the door open, push on it." And soon I heard, I pushed the door, and it opened. I ran up the steps, and soon I was in my grandmother's embrace. She brought me in, sat me down, fed me. Then she wanted to hear all about the train ride. Oh, I told her everything, including the trial of the magic little bowl and water, and how I had risen to the occasion. When she heard how I had risen to the occasion, Grandmother Louise, she put her head in her hands and she says, "Oh, the whole family is embarrassed." I said, "You can't be embarrassed. You weren't even there." Sometimes grandmothers can be really hard to please. But she told me to get a good night's sleep. The next day, I'd be going with her to her office where she worked. And we did. My grandmother, she worked at the American Bar Association Journal, a magazine for lawyers. She ran the magazine. She was the assistant to the editor-in-chief, but the editor-in-chief was out on a prolonged illness, so she ran the magazine. That first day, I watched things that I had never envisioned, because I used to read Life, look, see all the magazines, but here I saw a magazine coming to life. People typing articles, but in column form. Cutting, not like we cut and paste today with a computer, with scissors, cutting out, with glue, laying up the magazine, page by page, article by article. It was fascinating. I loved it. At the end of the day, we went home, and Grandma Louise, she said, "I want you to meet our upstairs neighbors. They're from Yugoslavia." We went upstairs, and she introduced me to Toma and Melissa and their 13-year-old daughter, Jovanka. I thought, this is going to be a great summer. Jovanka was beautiful. And they scooted us off to go talk and get to know each other. As we were talking, Jovanka let me know that she used an Americanized version, an English version of her name, Joanne. It was easier in school. Joanne and I hit it off. They let us go out around the neighborhood and explore. Joanne knew the neighborhood, of course. She was showing it to me. And like 2 blocks away from Grandmother's house, 2 blocks away, was the old Biograph Theater. That's where John Dillinger was shot when he came out of the movies with the lady in red. And the FBI, the G-men, had been there to corner him as he was public enemy number 1. They chased him down an alley and shot him to death in that alleyway. Joanne took me to a wooden power pole that stood in that alleyway and said, "Look, these holes are from the bullets that missed him." It was amazing, amazing to be in that spot. She and I started spending a lot of time together. But somehow Louise, Toma, and Melissa also realized that I was not a little boy anymore. And I heard them talking one day, and they said, "They go nowhere unescorted." So I knew that we would have to be with either my grandmother or one of her parents all the time. That was not a deterrent at all. In the course of that summer, they took me to Buckingham Fountain, this gorgeous fountain in Chicago. All these beautiful sculptures and water just spouting everywhere, and at night they put colored lights on it. We went to the Lincoln Park Zoo. We went to the Museum of Science and Industry, and I could have moved in there. It is just a miracle. It is so wonderful. But other things happened during the summer. Joanne came home from summer school one day, and she was crying. And by this time, I knew I was falling in love with this 13-year-old girl. And it broke my heart to see her cry. And I said, What happened at school? People called me a DP. It meant nothing to me. I said, Kenny, it means displaced person. Truthfully, still meant nothing to me. She had to explain to me that how much it hurt to be an immigrant, to have come here from Yugoslavia, to be hoping to have this be her homeland now, and to have the people that had been here just a bit longer than her saying, "You don't belong." were better than you. I could do nothing to take away that pain, but I certainly could understand it. Joanne mentioned during the summer that Toma was not her father. He was her stepfather. And I understood this because when I was 9, my parents had gotten a divorce. And I knew the anger that had grown in me for 4 years till I turned 13, and was still growing in me about the divorce and how little I got to see my father. And you wonder about things like a divorce when they happen. I had thought back many times to my mother and father and how they had eloped to be together. They were so in love. So how in the space of only 20 years could things change so much that they didn't want to be together anymore and they divorced? So I wondered about Joanne and her father. I said, well, wonder where he was. And one day I asked her, what happened to your birth father? Is he in Yugoslavia? She had a stricken look on her face. Her mother, she came around the corner, said, Kenny, let me answer the question for Joanne. Sit down. We all sat down. And Melissa, she looked at me and she said, Kenny, during World War II, the Nazis thought that my husband had information, secrets. They came to our house and they took us. And they started questioning my husband. They wanted to know what he knew, what secrets he was holding back. He knew nothing. He had no secrets at all that he was keeping from the Nazis. When they did not receive the answer they wanted, she said, with me standing there, holding Joanne in my arms, they drew their guns, shot and killed him. And then they turned to me. Melissa said they turned to me and they said, what do you know? I know nothing. I know nothing. I have no secrets from you. They would not believe me either. They took me for interrogation. I was questioned for hours. They still did not believe me. And they turned to torture. I was laid on a table. Melissa then, very discreetly, leaned over and took the hem of her dress and lifted it up to reveal her thigh about halfway up. Just enough that I could see going up each thigh was a large, red, angry welt. When I had nothing to confess and the Nazis did not believe me, they cut my thighs to see if that would make me remember something. I had nothing to remember. I had no secrets, Kenny, none. They still were not content. They took salt and put it in the wounds. After that excruciating, unbearable pain, I still could confess nothing. So they released me from the torture and the interrogation. And they sent me with Joanne into a prisoner of war camp. When she said camp, I remembered something. I remembered that I had watched John Wayne and Audie Murphy movies for years. And I liked watching them. They were great war movies. And then I saw a movie called Stalag 17. It changed my feeling about war forever. It showed how horrendous people truly can be to each other. It showed the Nazis in their most evil ways. And I looked at that. And when I saw Stalag 17, I came out of it and I told my friends, I said, I never want to be caught by the Nazis. Now, mind you, I knew that couldn't happen. I was born at the end of the war. The Nazis were gone. But what I meant is I never wanted anyone like a Nazi in my life to take that kind of control of me, ever. I realized also that somehow in the John Wayne movies, he was always a hero. Heroes didn't suffer a lot, and even if they were hurt, they rebounded in 10 or 15 minutes. That isn't the truth with how people were hurt in war. And Stalag 17 helped me to see that. Melissa's story was now bringing the war to life in a way I had never envisioned. I couldn't help but ask her, Melissa, what was it like in the camps? Kenny, had nothing. Nothing. Never enough clothes. Never enough heat in the winter. Never enough food. We were near starving most of the time. One day, a Nazi guard, in an act of kindness, opened the gate of the camp and allowed a starving horse to wander in. And he shut the gate behind the horse, trapping it. And then neither he nor any of the other Nazi guards intervened, as we, the prisoners, fell on that horse and killed it. He said we had to have food if we were to survive. I was in shock. We sat in quiet for a long time. I asked my grandmother if I could go up on the veranda that was out back of their houses. She said, yes. I just want to be alone. I went out there and I thought about what had happened to Melissa, to Joanne's father. And I realized, to my horror, that somehow the Nazis had affected me now. They had magically, somehow, reached through time and touched my life by having hurt someone that I loved. At first, on that rooftop, I was thinking such angry thoughts about the Nazis. But I knew they weren't the problem. It was bigger somehow. I thought of the bullies at Joanne's school and how when I first heard it, I thought, could I go beat them up? But I knew I couldn't. And what would it do? I thought about the bullies at my own school in California and how sometimes just because I was the tall kid, I was chased. Let's see if he can fight. I didn't want to fight. But then I had another image. I pictured my mother, my older sister and younger brother, and I saw their faces and how they reacted when at home I exploded. Because sometimes in the anger that had been building ever since the divorce, I would just erupt in anger. And when I saw their faces in my mind's eye, I thought, when I explode like that, I'm the bully. So it's not the Nazis. It's me. And I realized in some way, even as a 13-year-old, that until I came to peace within me, I would always be at war. My time in Chicago drew to an end shortly after that. Louise and I said goodbye to Toma and Melissa and Joanne, got in a car, and drove all the way across the country to Santa Monica. The American Bar Association was having a convention, and I was to go, and after that I'd be driven home. One day at the convention, I left my grandmother in one of the ballrooms of the hotel, and I went to the elevator to go up to our room. I got in the elevator. There was one other man there, and I recognized him. His hands were full of books and papers, but in an instant I knew who he was. His picture had been on the wall of almost every office at the American Bar Association. It was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. I was in awe. I immediately raced across the elevator and took his hand in mine that was filled with papers and started pumping his head wildly, just saying, Mr. Warren, I'm so honored to meet you. I'm Kenny Iverson, and my grandmother is Louise Child of the American Bar Association Journal, and I'm just so happy to meet you. And I stood back, and he was very gracious, although a little bit surprised. The door of the elevator opened. I was at my floor. I went to the room, and I waited for Louise to come. When she got up there, I told her all about my adventure in the elevator, that I'd met the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I said, I even went over and I took his hand and shook it, though it was filled with papers. He didn't seem to mind. And she looked at me and she said, you didn't tell him who you were, did you? I said, I sure did. And I made sure he knew I was your grandson. She got that look on her face again, like when I told her about the finger bowls. Grandmothers can be really difficult to please sometimes. Thank you. Thank you.